بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode in a series on Islamic legal maxims, Al-Qawaid Al-Fiqhiyya. Today's episode will be, at least we'll start with, Ad-daruratu tuqaddaru biqadriha, which means that necessity is to be assessed and treated proportionally. So this is a qualification or a restriction on the maxim that we mentioned in the last episode, ad-darurat tubih al-mahdhurat. Necessity renders the prohibited permissible. Because this is a principle, this whole principle of relaxation of normally stringent rules, it's a principle that could easily be misused and abused. Due to that fact, it is surrounded by numerous maxims that regulate the way that the basic concept is applied. If that isn't done, then people, they do things that they shouldn't be doing using this principle of hardship as a cover. And this is something that we see actually quite a lot of, and sometimes surprisingly, I've sat in on roundtable discussions where people with Sharia backgrounds invoke the concept of darura in a really sloppy, unacademic fashion. And it's most unbecoming, especially for someone with a Sharia background. And it's more excusable, but it's still not good when, for instance, you hear people who are laymen, and this comes up frequently in the Islamic finance industry. A lot of the people who work in Islamic banks, they got their skills with regard to banking by working in conventional banks. And for whatever reason, the conscience gnawing at them, or for perhaps other reasons, they left conventional banking and they came into the field of Islamic banking. So they don't have very much Sharia knowledge, but they've heard this term, darura. And so whenever something comes up that, this is prohibited according to the Sharia, they say, well, it's darura. So this principle of darura has to be applied according to the parameters that the Sharia has put down for it, and which the scholars of Sharia have identified by their study of those texts of the Sharia. So in looking at this principle, there's another phrasing of it that gives a similar sense. It says, إِذَا ضَاقَ الْأَمْرُ اتَّسَعَ وَإِذَا اتَّسَعَ ضَاقَ. And when you see phrasings like this, as was mentioned in the first episode in this series, it reflects the genius of the Muslim scholars who articulated these maxims, because they're so concise and they're so catchy. When you know the Arabic, they're just like, they just sum up these huge meanings in very, very few words, which are easy to remember. So إذا ضاق الأمر اتسع means when things become constrained, the Sharia's relaxation becomes vast. In other words, the law becomes permissive. But as circumstances ease, the law becomes strict. So, this is a proportional thing. When things are really difficult, the law becomes very relaxed. And when they become less difficult, then some of that rigor returns. And when they become normal, then the full rigor of the law is in place. So what this principle means then is that you can only use as much of the rukhsa as is necessary to take care of the problem. And you cannot exceed that limit. So all of those verses that talk about eating carrion and eating prohibited foods in the Quran, they all have these provisos that go along with them. For instance, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم فمن اضطر غير باغ ولا عاد فلا إثم عليه. So whoever is compelled by need without transgression and without craving that which he is forced to make use of, then there is no sin upon him. So the restriction here is applied that the person should not be transgressing the limits and should not be enjoying the haram that he is making use of. And in another similar passage, فَمَنِ اضْطُرَّ فِي مَخْمَصَةٍ غَيْرَ مُتَجَانِفٍ لِإِثْمٍ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. But if any is forced by hunger, with no intention of doing wrong, Allah is most forgiving, most merciful. Then we have an example from the Sunnah. The Prophet ﷺ was asked about someone who is hungry and he goes into an orchard and he eats somebody else's fruit. And he said, if a person in need eats without taking any fruit out of the orchard, there's no penalty on him. But if he takes some of it out with him, he must pay double the equivalent in restitution, and he is subject to a discretionary penalty. So he differentiated. You go in and you eat, so you're eating just enough to satisfy your need. And if you carry something out of the orchard with you, that means that you're doing more than you needed to do in order to deal with your problem. Now, with regard to eating prohibited foods, this concept of only eating enough to get by, according to the need, it's widely stated among the scholars, but it has a certain flexibility to it also. Let's say that a person is in the desert and you run out of food and then you come upon a camel that has died. So you eat from that meat and then it's time to travel again. So you're in a desert, you don't have food, so the idea that, well, you just took enough to get by and now you hope for the best. No, your situation has not changed as far as being in the desert and being without food except this food. So you take what you can with you in order to continue your journey, in order to get to a place where you don't need it anymore. And we see an example of that from the Sunnah. The Prophet ﷺ, he sent out an expedition of 300 men under the leadership of Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah. And he gave, everybody had a bag of dates. And then they started to run out of food. And so he collected all the dates and he would give each person one date. I guess the number decreased. They reached the point where they're only being given one date per day. So they finally reached the seashore and they found this whale that had washed up ashore. So they ate from it and they stayed there and ate to get their strength back. And the whale was so big that all 300 men ate from it and then they filled their satchels with it. and they brought it back to Medina. And they told the Prophet ﷺ about it, and he said, "Is there any left?" They said, "Yeah." And so he took some and he ate from it. Now, what he was showing them was that principle that the animals that are from the sea, that rule of carrion, of being maita, doesn't apply to them. And so he ate in order to show that this is permissible in and of itself. It's not just a case of darura. But when they thought it was darura, they ate according to their need. Now, another example of this principle from the time of Ali ibn Abi Talib was that he was faced with rebellion. And so he had to fight the rebels. But he gave his soldiers instructions that don't chase down the rebels who flee the battlefield. Don't kill a wounded rebel soldier. If you capture rebel soldiers, you're not allowed to execute them. So all of these were rules that were put in place by Ali, showing his deep fiqh that, yes, he was forced to use violent means to suppress a rebellion, but these rebels were Muslims. And the basic rule with regard to Muslims is that their lives are to be respected. And so he only used as much force as was necessary to deal with the problem. We'll take a break and come back, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum, welcome back. We're discussing the principle that darura tuqaddaru biqadriha, that need must be assessed, or necessity must be assessed and treated proportionally. Some of the applications of this principle in fiqh: if a doctor needs to see the aura of a patient in order to treat them, the doctor should only see that amount of the aura that's necessary in order to deliver the proper treatment. Other parts of the body, which are also part of the aura, but are not necessary to be exposed in order to achieve the objective, then they should remain covered. Let's say that a person is forced to tell a lie in order to save his life. He is allowed to do that. However, he can't tell a lie that will cause somebody else to be murdered by that oppressor in order to save his life. Let's say also that a judge determines that a person who has debts is bankrupt. He's not going to be able to pay his debts. So at that point, he declares him bankrupt and he sells his property in order to pay his creditors. Okay, he's only allowed to sell as much of the property as is required to cover the debts. He can't sell more than that, because the basic principle that people, they have the right to their property, and nobody can step in from outside to dispose of another person's property. And in this case, the exception is made due to other people's rights which have become attached to that person's wealth, but the overriding only is allowed to the extent to solve that problem. Another example is a waqf. Let's say that you have an orphanage, and the orphanage has run short of operating funds in order to take care of the needs of the orphans. And this same waqf has certain property that can be sold in order to generate the necessary funds to maintain the activities of the orphanage. In that situation, the nadir, the trustee who manages the waqf, would have to go before a judge, and that judge, if he determines that this is a real situation, would permit the sale of enough of those assets to generate the necessary funds to keep the orphanage running. So that's that qaida. There's another corollary of this major maxim, which is that al-mashaqqatu tajlibu at-taysir, hardship begets facility, which says يغتفر في الوسائل ما لا يغتفر في المقاصد. And this is basically making a distinction between primary prohibitions and secondary prohibitions. There are certain things which are prohibited in and of themselves, and there are other things which are prohibited as a sort of a ring fence around the core prohibition. So for instance, the issue that we mentioned earlier of a doctor looking at the aura of a woman for the sake of medical treatment. The prohibition of looking at a woman who is not your wife is a secondary prohibition which is intended to protect the primary prohibition, which is la taqrabu zina, don't come close to adultery. So that primary prohibition, there's really no circumstance where it would be relaxed. I mean, we mentioned that case of the woman in the time of Umar radiallahu anh. The act didn't become lawful because of that, but the punishment was averted from her because of it. So the prohibition of zina continues basically under all circumstances. And that's a primary prohibition. The prohibition of looking at a woman is to serve that primary prohibition. And so there are situations where it can be waived. So, you know, a woman who is basically covered, you can deal with her in the course of buying and selling, bearing witness, but that's within the limits of Islamic etiquette, decorum. However, this issue of a doctor looking at a woman's aura, it becomes permissible even if it's not at the level of darura. If it's at the level of haja, which the distinction between the two we'll go into in detail in the next episode. But because there's a difference between the primary prohibition and the secondary prohibition, then they are treated differently in the way that the prohibition work and that exceptions can work to it. Another example of that is riba al-fadl. There are two kinds of riba. There's riba al-nasiya, which is the one that most people are familiar with, that if you have a debt and the time to pay passes, the amount increases, that's riba al-nasiya. There's another kind of riba, which is riba al-fadl, which involves the unequal exchange of the same kind of commodity, barter transactions. So the Prophet ﷺ, he prohibited a transaction of dry dates for fresh dates because the fresh dates have a higher water volume, and as they dry, then the amount becomes different. However, he made an exception for bay'ul araya, and this is a kind of a sale which was intended in that time to allow people who were quite poor to eat fresh dates. It was a cash-poor economy, so there were lots of people who couldn't get their hands on gold and silver. And for those people, they were allowed to purchase the yield of 1 or 2 or 3 date palm trees, where they would pay with dried dates in order to be able to eat fresh dates, because this was a situation where the riba al-fadl, Ibn al-Qayyim makes this point, the prohibition of riba al-fadl is like a ring fence around the core prohibition, which is riba al-nasiya. And the prohibition of riba al-nasiya, there's no instances of its really being allowed due to need in any kind of a Sharia text. Whereas you have an example of riba al-fadl where there was an exception made to the prohibition, which indicates that there's a differing level of prohibition between those two cases of riba. So this is another major principle that modulates the way in which the principles of relaxation due to hardship can be used according to the intention of the lawgiver. And so we come to the end of this episode. Walhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.